All right, we are starting with the Lean Space Pod in a remote studio. Welcome to Jaya Gupta and Ashu Garg from Foundation Capital.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Jaya, we apparently met 3 years ago at the LangChain hackathon where Factory was born. Were you also actively thinking about like context stuff back then, or like what was the vibe 3 years ago?
Yeah, I think 3 years ago was probably like the first AI hackathon, and I cannot say I was thinking about context things at that time. I was just thinking about and I think it was actually like before even agents took off. Like it was like literally right after ChatGPT. And I think the only things that really existed were LangChain, Llama Index, and like Perplexity were like sort of the three companies that came out right after. And so anything that they were doing, I think all the AI builders were going and running there and going into like whether it was like Notion's office, I'm pretty sure had a hackathon, but definitely it was not context back then. It was even pre-agents. And so it's like crazy to see where we've come in just a short amount of time.
Yeah. I mean, abstractly, I guess like LangChain, Llama Index, and to some extent Perplexity also, they funnel context into LLMs. And we weren't working on agents back then, but obviously at some point we would start. Like even back then there was discussion already. Ashu, what's your sort of AI story as well? Like I'd love to introduce the audience.
Yeah, sort of the very short version. I used to run a machine learning team at Microsoft in 2006. We were doing ad targeting. And after you've done ad targeting for a few years, you want to do something that's better for the soul. So I left with a variety of ideas. I bumped into a guy called Jan Stojka at Conviva, which was my first portfolio company. And they were doing applied AI at the time, but they ran into a bunch of data infrastructure problems. And that led to, Databricks and Anyscale, and then a whole series of other applied AI companies. So I'm lucky enough to hang out with Jaya and Jan and other smart people. That's my claim to fame.
Well, you guys work on really, really smart things. And congrats again on having the early hit of 2026. I would say, so I'm going to bring this up on screen right now, which is the context graphs discussion, which is what we're here to have. So Jaya actually tweeted basically like the article version of this, but obviously there's the actual formal blog post. I'm just kind of curious what the origin story of this is. Like, were you sitting in a room and you were talking like, hey, we need a name for this thing, we see an opportunity? What was going on in December that you started working on this?
Go for it, Jaya.
It's a good question. So, I think, we sort of throughout December, and I would say more broadly, like the last 6 to 12 months, we, Foundation Capital, like we spent a lot of time with our companies very up close. And so, one of the things that Ashu and I kept continuously talking about, and what we were thinking about was like, what is actually missing as AI agents move into production? Like, if you think back, like everyone said 2025 would be the year of agents. And in some ways it was, we got Claude Code, we got like Devin, we got all these customer support agents, Sierra, Decagon. And I think, at the same time, the models also got dramatically more capable. But I think, when you think deeply about like what is missing, you kind of realize like, that they still can't reliably do enterprise work, some of these agents. And so, we started thinking about it and like it kind of struck us that, one of the reasons is that because they don't actually capture like why we do certain things, like, and the human reasoning behind decisions. And so like specifically, what do we mean? Like why exceptions are granted, how conflicts are resolved, what precedents are applied. And that's sort of kind of what the thinking was over the last 6 months. And I think in December, we got to writing about it and published sort of last thing right before the year ended.
Yeah, I think the thing I would add to that is, the subtext, at least for us, and I think for a lot of other people over the last year, has been that as so much of the IP is captured in the model itself, what is the role of applied AI companies broadly? Systems of agents companies, systems of record, and what is the defensible moat? And I think we've been debating that with Animesh at Player Zero, with Ishan at Olive, with Kabir at Tessera, and so many of our founders. And they were all talking about the same thing, but using different languages or different words. And so I think it was that series of conversations that gave us this insight that there is an intermediate abstraction, which we call context graphs, which is the accumulation of decision traces. And this intermediate abstraction, in our opinion, will be the one that will matter the most over the next decade. It's the enduring layer for the most successful application companies or systems of agents companies. And we also believe, and we'll talk about it more, that it's unique and new and it's not well suited for incumbents.
That is actually very key because obviously the incumbents could also capitalize on it if they see the opportunity. You did name drop Animesh. I did have him categorized in our Discord. We have a Discord where we discuss all these like trends and stuff. And so, I didn't know he was your portfolio company.
Yeah, no,
It's
he's
a very
been a
coordinated
big
thing.
part of coming out of the thesis along with a bunch of other founders like, Kabir, as I said, at Tessera and Ishan at Olive. But Animesh is definitely a brilliant technical founder who's helped push our thinking.
Okay. How about let's do like a very crisp, like we have a deck that you guys kindly sort of put together. I think definitions always help motivate a discussion. So let's just go right into how do we define a context graph and all the other sort of related concepts.
Yeah, go for it.
You go for it. Go for definitions.
Look, I think we can describe it's a concept, and so you can describe it in a variety of ways. But at its essence, a context graph is the institutional memory of all the why behind a set of decisions. And we think of that core unit as a decision trace. When an agent or a system of agents executes a business process, it goes through a dozen, maybe multiple dozen steps. It may have humans in the loop once or many times. And the tracking these exceptions, these overrides, this cross-system context, which sits in both structured and unstructured systems, and very often in people's heads, and that's where the human in the loop comes in, capturing that as a decision trace. And when you aggregate decision traces in a way that you can then learn from them as an agent, and you can use them to make the agent better, that fabric or becomes what we call the decision graph.
Decision graph or decision trace?
Sorry, my apologies. That layer becomes a context graph. My mistake. The context graph.
So context graph is made up of a lot of decision traces.
It's made up of a lot of decision traces, and it's also, when you implement that, you will have to implement it in a way that you can actually extract insight from this, and you can make it machine usable by the agents themselves.
And then one thing I want to get clear up front, like this is kind of like a conceptual thing, right? Like, has anyone claimed to like have this working yet? Because it seems like very, very big.
What do you think, Jaya? You talk to a lot of people.
I do talk to a lot of people. I would say that if you look at Twitter today and you look at LinkedIn, thousands of people claim to have it working. I've had like maybe 30.
There's this guy. Animesh is like how to build a context graph. So he seems very confident.
Yes, he is. I think Player Zero is actually one of the examples that actually has some version of this working. I think that what's interesting about this is that there's going to be a lot of different implementations of it, and so I think you have companies like Glean that have come out and say that we're the ones that are building this. You have companies like Atlan, like data cataloging companies, have said that we're going to own this. You have application companies that have put out their version of this. I think not Harvey, but Rocks put out Approach, Actively put out Approach. There's companies across the app layer that have also, said that they're building this. And so I think you will see infra companies, application companies, security companies. Okta put out something as well. And so, but in terms of like seeing like this actually deployed at scale, like I think there are very few examples today. And some of that is because it's a very, new concept.
So I think the only thing I would add to that is don't think of context graphs as a technology architecture. Think of it as a framework, and there will be multiple technology implementations, and those will evolve over time. And different companies will use different components, different databases, different data fabrics in order to build that context graph. And it'll depend on the use case and the situation. What we are seeing from our portfolio, at least, is that the common theme across these systems of agent companies that we think are doing revolutionary stuff is they are building a context graph. They're early, but we're seeing it. We see that at Player Zero. We see that at Tessera. We see that at Olive. We see that at Anvilogic in the security context. Now, there are varying degrees of sophistication because it's a concept as against a specific product.
And so this very sort of flexible concept. Is there like an ideal data structure, I guess, for a context graph? Like, is it just, like the sort of triplet entities of a knowledge graph or anything like that?
Go for it, Jaya.
I think no. And I think that's because it's more of a framework for now. I think that you will see, I would say it's like the concept of decision traces, especially, like I think that is going to be implemented by like many different types of companies, and there will be also many different types of companies that will emerge because of this. Like thinking about like security, governance, I think you'll see companies that pop up there, and we're already starting to see a few pitches there. Where we're going to see like companies that are going to reimagine different sorts of applications. So I think with this logic, you could reimagine how do you build Sierra today versus, a lot of these application companies started 3 years ago. And so if you were to rebuild them starting today, I think that's also what we're seeing. And I think as well as on infra, like we've already started to see like different people like imagine, how do you think of, data catalogs of the future, databases of the future. I think those approaches are quite early. I think you also see like a lot of the graph database people come out of the woodworks and say that, this is us as well. So
We've been doing this the whole
we've
time.
been doing this for the last 10 years. I think most of my notifications when I get tagged and I press and it's like, this is what I've been trying to articulate for the last 10 years. Like, and here it is.
At the same time, there are some common themes of people who are building context graphs. And, the underlying infrastructure or technology implementation will vary depending on your starting point and your scale, but they tend to be cross-functional. They tend to be cross-process. They tend to these decision traces are stitching together data that goes across multiple existing systems of record. They tend to be in the right path, which is you're executing a decision. And it's not analytical decisions, it's the actual operational decisions you're making. Existing systems of agents, startups actually have a very unique advantage because they're not bound by a business process. They're not bound by an existing data store. They're in the orchestration path. And being in the orchestration path for automation of a business process positions you uniquely to capture decision traces and therefore build a context graph.
Yeah, you have that in this slide here, and also I guess in your post where you talked a little bit about why the incumbents don't do it. I think like one of the interesting things I want to sort of double click on. First of all, systems of agents. I've heard this terminology. Is that widely adopted? Because I would say that you're the first in recent months that I've heard actually use this term. What is a system of agents startup?
Go for it, Jaya.
Well, I guess out of curiosity, what term have you heard, to describe systems of agents?
Don't know. I mean, I think that's also like up for interpretation as to like what exactly it means. I do think like people have like system of record, as like a baseline of like, okay, we all agree what a system of record is. Beyond that, like people try to modify it in some way, system of like context, whatever. System of agents, like sure, you have like I guess a group of agents, I guess, and they all do different things. But I don't know if this is like a deeper origin or community around this term yet.
So, the way I would think about it is, and look, these terms are all colliding. And it's a little bit like, a cloud of words. The notion of a system of agent is a company that has a collection of agents that are automating a process or a set of processes. It was initially, we came up with that last year to differentiate from, more basic chatbot-like systems. So, if, a lot of systems, a lot of AI companies are single player mode, more like a chatbot. And to the extent that you're starting to build something that's multi-agent, multiplayer mode, has humans in the loop, and is driving decisions across a business process, we wanted to distinguish that with this notion of a system of agent. The underlying moat that these systems of agents are building is a context graph. And the way they build the context graph is by capturing the decision traces that they inherently execute. So it is a mouthful. And any advice on how to simplify would be appreciated.
The term that I've been working on is mostly just Agent Lab, the company that produces agents. But I think those are like slightly different things in any way as well. So it's hard to describe. I think I just want to like double click on a few of these things so that people can get a sense of like what you mean when you say those things. I think the other thing that's also super interesting is being in the read path, not the write path. Obviously, with your background with Databricks, you understand the read path very, very well. I think the write path is also interesting. Like context is mostly a read job. Write mostly just like introduces a higher demand for uptime and lower latency and all those things. But I'm also curious, like basically, the way that this creates a waterfall in my mind of exceptions, override precedents, cross-system context. Also, I put here approval chains, which you had in your original document. It feels more like IAM, like AWS IAM, like some authorization sort of logic system that cascades down, and hopefully you like I derive some kind of formal logic reasoning that you can sort of inspect and version control maybe. Because like I think that the worst thing is like when you capture all decision traces and you look at all the overrides and all the precedents, it looks like Swiss cheese, like people contradict themselves all the time. And you're like, okay, well, what's the truth of it? And an LLM is going to be completely confused, reasonably so.
Look, I think it's a great point. And I think when you think about read versus write, it can mean a very different thing when you're if you're being precise and technical. I think when we think about the read versus write path is analytical systems, which are in the read path, are ultimately, and you ultimately have to write to an analytical system. So there is some write path in that sense. That's why technically it means something very different. But analytical systems like data warehouses and even systems of record capture the end point of a decision. They know what happened. So they may know what the revenue of a company is. They may know what the deal size was. They may know what the discount offered was. They may know sort of what was the patch applied in the case of a bug fix. What they don't know, so that's because that's ultimately stored in some analytical system, whatever that system might be. And to that extent, systems of records are more analytical in nature than they are in the right path, where agentic systems or systems of agents actually capture the sequence of steps. What did you do? So if you're using Player Zero, there's a support ticket that comes in. That support ticket, then, someone picks it up, some agent, not even a human being first. It does some analysis. It starts to run some queries. All of that is stitched together. It then, at some point, pulls a human being into the loop. That human being is then doing a bunch of queries themselves, because they look at what the agents have presented to them, and they start to query the system. All of those queries then ultimately lead to some decision or some hypothesis around what the root cause of the problem is, and therefore what the bug fix is. That whole, starting with a ticket as an example, to auto triaging, to hypothesis generation, to sort of bug fixes, to ultimately then translates into a piece of code that gets pushed into production, and it either works or it doesn't. You complete that loop. That loop is the right path, the way we think about right path.
Yeah, I see.
As against the narrowly defined read-write path in a database, which is, I think, where you're coming from.
Yes, because
which is technically more precise. Which is technically more precise.
Yeah, but here you're writing code, so it's still the right path, but it's different. Yeah, and I think my question there would be like, do people want to use a separate platform for it, or should it just be inside of GitHub and Slack, and those things will still continue to win? Or basically, obviously, people want to prefer their defaults, the things that they're used to. Is there a case to be made for putting these onto like a new thing, like whether it's Player Zero or something else?
Why don't I get stab, Jay, and then you should jump in as well. So I absolutely think it'll be a new thing. Now, the key is that these new platforms, whether it's Player Zero or Olive or Tessera, or pick your favorite one, they will have to coexist with existing systems. And so the system of engagement may end up being Slack. You may communicate with Player Zero through Slack. You may communicate with it through other systems you have, because you're not going to replace those, at least not overnight. But these existing systems don't actually orchestrate across an entire business process. To some extent, systems of record do. But even in systems of record, what you see is systems of record were very historically all designed for structured data. So even if you're running a deal process through Salesforce, as an example, very quickly you find the data is not in Salesforce, it's in Slack in part. It's in email. Actually, the number one system of record for most organizational data is email.
It's email, yeah.
And Slack. So, but email and Slack just captures data. I mean, as a blob, and again, technically not as a blob. I mean, if you get into sort of data structures, but the data is dark data in a sense in Slack and in email, and an agentic system that has a real context graph will capture the pieces of data that are appropriate across email, across Salesforce, across your account management system, across a conversation, and across a Zoom call. All of these have data, some structured, some unstructured, and most of the value is actually in the unstructured data. And this is part of why context graphs are so hard to build, that you have to figure out how to parse the unstructured data in a way that you capture value and insight. Because if you started uploading every Zoom call you have in a sales situation, you'd have like 1 million Zoom calls and only noise. And so where the unstructured data is such a large part of it and conversation data is such a large part, most likely the context graph will actually consist of small models. The context graph itself is a model layer. Like you use that data to train a set of models, which then become part of your context graph. In the case of Player Zero, actually the data set is much more semi-structured. It's less Zoom calls and more code and tickets and observability, which all has some level of structure. Very large data sets, but with more implied structure. And so the way you would implement a context graph is very different. It's more of a traditional graph structure. Maybe it's a relational database with a graph layer on top.
Yeah, Jaya, I don't know if you have any notes to add on that.
Yeah, I don't think any more to add.
Got it. One thing I wanted to move on to also is obviously there's a huge amount of community discussion. You also dedicated a slide to just the pushbacks. I actually wouldn't say pushbacks, but feel free to just capture pushbacks. Like let's go directly and address the elephants in the room.
Yeah. So I can take this one. So I think, a lot of the, and I don't know if it's pushback, but like a lot of the people that are, maybe taking other opinions and sides, which I love, because it pushes our thinking too, is that, one of the things that we keep hearing is like, well, you actually can't capture the real why, and like you can only capture the how. And the true, intent is actually like really internal to the human. And the only thing you can actually capture is a sequence of actions and interactions. I think Glean actually uses those exact words. And they say that you can capture the how. I think that some of that is, like, in some cases, that's true. But I also think that there's a way to get to, like, I think Animesh talks about in his blog post, but like the partial why, and start to be able to reconstruct the why. And I think that, the reason that is because, like, I think before AI agents, well, humans were making these decisions, and, now that agents are going to do the work, they sort of need some sort of access to that sort of memory. And then two, I think LLMs also made some of this capture more feasible. Pre-LLMs, you kind of needed humans to maybe manually structure sort of every decision, and no one wants to do that. Like, I think it takes a lot of work to write down why I did something. That's why sometimes, like, you go through Salesforce and you look at like there's a bunch of text boxes about like, notes, and like those notes are probably always empty, is my guess.
Yeah. Someday we'll force all employees to wear a BCI device so we can read their thoughts and capture everything.
Exactly.
I will not name the company, but I have a portfolio CEO that does that. He and everyone in his team, they have this watch thing that they wear that captures, and it auto connects the data back to their calendar.
Yeah. Auto transcribing, I think, is actually honestly a reasonable thing. Privacy has to be like worked out, but honestly, it's no different than like an employer owning all the Slack conversations and all that.
Totally. Yeah.
You refer to privacy, and I would say one of the really critical things, which is both there's some pushback, but I also think we acknowledge right in the original post is going to be critical, is you've got to manage. There's data governance issues. There's sensitive data that is organization specific. So in order to effectively capture these decision traces and then operationalize them in the form of context graph, there's a lot of work that companies will have to do around data governance and data management. And, we have a company that's Skyflow that Jay and I worked with that does a lot of work in PII and sensitive data management.
Yeah.
Again, it's Skyflow.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. So, again, they're pioneering an approach to addressing this issue. There's still a lot to be figured out, but key to success in building a context graph will be data management, data security.
And then I think that the second point that is interesting as well related to that is, a lot of people kind of like said, hey, this is like, metadata 3.0, and this is like, I forgot what someone used. It was very funny language, but I think it's like, metadata, this is metadata 3.0. It's like the new sparkling water of France or something. I don't know what Gen Z phrase is going on. But what was interesting, I think, about that, and what a lot of people responded to it. Well, hey, the same objection was raised about CRMs, about observability, and about data warehouses as well. And so, new categories, I think, they emerge when there's a new unit of value worth storing. And I think the difference here is that decision traces are sort of captured as part of the execution path and not sort of defined up front in all these like workshops and reconstructed after the fact via ETL. And they're more like emerging as a byproduct of agents doing work, which I think is architecturally like a little bit different than metadata layers. And I think the second point there is like the difference is also when and how it's sort of captured. Like I think with metadata, and this also goes to ontologies, I think that's like another point that's coming up, is that there's a lot of like upfront tax of like, hey, I need to go model a bunch of stuff out with like a bunch of consultants, a bunch of stakeholders, and do a bunch of workshops, where I think this is a little bit different.
I think that all makes sense. I'm entertained to see this mentioned as data mesh again. I wonder if the data mesh discussion is like a bad comparison, or like actually a pretty good one, because in a large enough enterprise company, and this piece was very focused on enterprise, you do have silos that emerge, and sometimes for a good reason, and sometimes they should not be joined.
Yeah,
I don't know.
So you're onto something that Jay and I talk about a lot, which is, and the last slide just references this a little bit. The word data mesh can mean whatever you want it to mean. So arguably a context graph is one form of a data mesh. But typically when people have talked about data meshes, they have this notion of one universal data mesh across a large enterprise.
Yes.
And we don't actually believe that will be the case. We think context graphs, because they have to emerge from the automation of a specific set of tasks or business processes. Like no one's going to do or can do the work to say, let me capture all the decision traces in an organization and put them in one universal context graph. It sounds a little bit like solving world hunger. And it's a good idea, but very hard to implement.
Yes.
Our core thesis is these context graphs will emerge organically. And they'll emerge organically because just as processes get automated and human beings are incentivized to be humans in the loop, because really they are providing a lot of the training data. The why is coming from the actions that human beings take as part of a decision in an existing business process automation. And so Player Zero is doing that for the whole process of code, from going into, testing all the way to code in production. And there's an entire workflow once you generate code, and they touch every part of that workflow. Similarly, Olive does the same thing for sales. And those are just two different workflows of business processes in a company. Like there's no reason why companies would want to put both data sets or both context graph in one universal context graph. And sure, companies or people who are selling context graphs can sell to both of these companies. But ultimately, no company's going to wake up one day and say, I want to build a universal context graph. And then if you look at some of the things that Arvind from Glean has said, and Glean's an amazing company, and I have a lot of respect for Arvind, but it's so horizontal. Like it's a very powerful chatbot, and it allows people to build some agentic applications or systems of agents on top of them, but really the deep cross-functional, cross-process automation problems are going to be solved, I think, by companies that are dedicated to solving that problem. You can call it vertical specific, you can call it horizontal. My partner, Joanne, that Jay and I work with, has a company called Tenor. Tenor is solving the process of automating, the intake process for patients in specialized healthcare situations, specialized clinics, whether it's sleep clinics, specialized testing processes. So again, they're capturing very similar workflow. It's almost like, in the old world, we call it CRM for specialized healthcare clinics, but it's so much more today. And they're capturing those decision traces, and they'll build the context graph for that. And what Jay and I think about all day, every day, is how do we identify which use cases, business processes, verticals will have the deepest moats over the next decade. We can build. The way we're going to build a universal context graph is by having 100 portfolio companies that have context graphs. And the winning ones are hopefully the winning context graphs.
Yeah. Okay, I think a very useful concept. We're coming up on time, and I just want to make sure that we've sort of adequately addressed or encapsulated everything that we know or the community is excited about. There's a lot of discussions, and I think people are going to build out different versions of this. What is do you have any predictions on what we're going to see by year end that are falsifiable, that has a chance of being wrong? I think that these are my ways of trying to test. Have we sort of progressed in our understanding of what we need to build?
I think that's the alpha. I feel like that's the alpha. Can we give it away?
Yeah.
It's the alpha. I don't know if we can give that away.
Okay.
I'm kidding.
I would say some things are easy to, there's a lot that we're talking about what's next. And so, as Jay said, there's a lot of alpha there. But look, we believe that a year from now, you will actually have hundreds of context graphs in production at scale.
Yeah, you said that. Yeah.
So that's belief number one. Two, I think the enabling infrastructure stack for context graphs will be well defined, and there will be variations and flavors. But I totally anticipate that this time next year we'll be writing. Okay, here's the best practice stack. Just like once upon a time there was the modern data stack, there'll be the context graph stack, and it will be 10 times more important and 10 times more valuable. And lastly, I would say, the debate about what is a context graph and what are decision traces and why they matter will go away. And the question will be, how do we extract value from context graphs? But we're merely scratching the surface. Once you have a context graph, it's a little bit my context graph versus yours. And different people will do different things to extract value and drive further automation. Because automation is always a staircase. The more value you can extract from the context graph, the more you can automate, and the more you automate, the more decision traces you capture, the more, you will capture in your context graph. So the best companies will be debating how to sort of accelerate that flywheel 12 months from now.
That's a good challenge to folks. Sometimes I also use these as kind of a call to action. If people are working on these problems, they resonate with it, they should reach out to you, obviously. But I'm sure you have a lot of people reaching out as well.
Yeah.
Well, Jay and I are open for business 24/7, definitely holidays. So give us a shout.
Yeah, we're recording on a holiday for those listening later. But no, thank you so much for joining, and congrats on basically creating this category. I'm excited to see what you do with it. I think it's early days still. I think we'll still be checking back on this, 6 months, 12 months from now, and we'll hope to see a lot more people building out what they see as context graphs within their organizations. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.